A guy I know took 7 years to save his first $100,000. 7 years. He wasn't making some ridiculous executive salary. He drove a 2016 Honda Accord, rented a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate, packed lunch most weekdays, and automatically moved money into his investment account every payday. It was slow, painfully slow, but eventually, he looked at the account and saw that first $100,000. And that's when he made a mistake that sounds completely reasonable until you actually run the math. He figured, if it took me 7 years to get to $100,000, and $1 million is 10 times as much, it'll take me another 63 years. 7 years for the first 100,000, another 63 for the remaining 900,000. 70 years total. He wasn't being lazy. He wasn't bad at math. He was making one of the most expensive mental mistakes you can make with money, assuming wealth grows in a straight line. Hey, I'm Brian, and I spend way too much time thinking about why some people spend decades trying to build wealth, while others eventually reach a point where their money starts doing a surprising amount of the work. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what happens between $100,000 and $1 million, why the timeline compresses, and why the last several $100,000 can arrive dramatically faster than the first. So if you want to understand the math, instead of just hearing another motivational speech about compound interest, stay with me. Because the assumption that trapped this guy was simple. He told himself, if it took 7 years to make the first $100,000, every additional $100,000 should take about 7 years too. That's the wrong assumption. That's the misconception. You're treating your portfolio like a paycheck. You work, you earn, you save, you repeat. So your brain naturally expects the result to increase at roughly the same speed every year. But an invested portfolio doesn't work that way. Your contributions are linear. The money you've already invested is not. Once your money gets large enough, it starts producing returns on top of previous returns. Think about a snowball rolling downhill. At the beginning, you're doing almost all the work. The snowball is tiny. It barely looks different after another few feet. But eventually, the snowball gets large enough that every revolution picks up more snow than the last. The hill hasn't changed. The physics haven't changed. The snowball has. And that's exactly what happens to your money. If you're new here and just subscribed, comment your name below. I read every comment and shout out new subscribers in my next video. I do appreciate you joining me on this finance journey. Picture that snowball at the very top of the hill. You push it. Nothing impressive happens. You push it again. Still nothing. You might even wonder whether the whole thing is pointless. That's what the first few years of investing can feel like. You put in $500. Then another $500. Then another. You check your account and think, that's it? Maybe you've contributed $6,000 over the year, and your balance is only a little higher than that. It doesn't feel like wealth. It feels like saving. And that's the frustrating part. Your behavior is already working, but the visible result hasn't caught up yet. Then the snowball gets bigger, and now something changes. The return generated by the snowball starts becoming meaningful compared with the effort you're putting into pushing it. Eventually, you're no longer looking at a portfolio where your contributions are the main event. You're looking at a portfolio where the portfolio itself is generating a substantial amount of the growth. That's the point most people underestimate. The early years build the machine. The later years let the machine run. Let's make this painfully concrete. Suppose you invest $500 every month. That's $6,000 a year. You don't increase it dramatically. You don't pick the next hot stock. You simply invest consistently and earn an average annual return of roughly 7% over the long run. And remember, 7% isn't a promise. Markets don't deliver a smooth 7% every year. Some years are up. Some years are ugly. We're using 7% simply to illustrate the mathematics. In year 1, you've contributed $6,000. With growth, you're around $6,200. Not exactly life-changing. You might look at that number and think, why am I bothering? That's the first psychological test. Year 5, you've put in $30,000 of your own money. Your account is around $36,000. So after 5 years, the market has added roughly $6,000. Your effort is still doing most of the work. That's why this stage feels so slow. Now move to year 10. You've contributed $60,000. Your portfolio is around $87,000. Now the picture is different. The market has contributed roughly $27,000. You're still putting in $6,000 a year, but the money you've already invested is becoming increasingly productive. And then you reach $100,000. This is where something psychologically important starts happening. Imagine you've built a portfolio of $100,000. At an average 7% return, that portfolio could generate about $7,000 in a year. You might have contributed $6,000 that year. Now the portfolio's potential annual growth is roughly comparable to what you're adding yourself. That's the crossover. You are still pushing the snowball, but the snowball is finally big enough to help push itself. And this is why looking at your first $100,000 and assuming the next $900,000 will take 9 times as long is so misleading. The first $100,000 is being built mostly by you. The later hundreds of thousands can increasingly be built by a combination of you and the capital you've already accumulated. That's the entire game. The fatal mental error is linear thinking. You look backward. I made $10,000 last year, so I'll probably make another $10,000 next year. Or, it took me 7 years to reach $100,000, so another 7 years should get me to $200,000. But that's not how compounding behaves. There's a famous story about a chessboard and grains of rice. The request is simple. Put 1 grain on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, and keep doubling. At first, it looks ridiculous. A few grains, then a handful, then a pile. But by the later squares, the numbers become so enormous that your intuition simply stops working. That's what exponential growth does. The early numbers teach you the wrong lesson about the later numbers. And investing has the same problem. Your first few years are not a reliable preview of what your portfolio will look like decades later. They're the setup, not the payoff. The first major inflection point is $100,000. Not because $100,000 magically changes your life. It doesn't. But mathematically, the relationship between your contributions and your portfolio starts changing. Let's say you're contributing $500 a month. That's $6,000 a year. A $100,000 portfolio earning 7% doesn't guarantee anything, but mathematically, 7% of $100,000 is $7,000. That's more than your annual contribution. Think about what that means. For the first time, the capital you've accumulated has the potential to generate more in a year than you're putting in yourself. That's a major psychological shift. I know someone who described reaching roughly this level as the moment investing stopped feeling like throwing money into a hole. Before that point, every contribution felt like a sacrifice. Afterward, the account itself started producing numbers large enough to notice. But there's a trap here. People hit $100,000 and suddenly think they've figured everything out. They start taking bigger risks. They chase individual stocks. They increase spending because they feel rich. Or they stop contributing because they think the portfolio is now big enough. Don't. $100,000 isn't the finish line. It's the point where the snowball is finally large enough for you to notice its momentum. And what happens next is where the math starts getting genuinely interesting. And if $100,000 is where the snowball starts becoming noticeable, $650,000 is where the psychology can change again. Why $650,000? Because at a 7% average return, that portfolio has the mathematical potential to generate about $45,500 in a year. That's not guaranteed. Markets don't send you a paycheck every December. But the scale matters. You're now talking about potential annual growth that gets surprisingly close to what many households earn from working. I had a friend who worked at an accounting firm who experienced a version of this around $600,000. He didn't quit his job. That wasn't the point. What changed was how he felt about the job. He told me that before building that portfolio, every difficult conversation with his boss felt like a threat. Afterward, it didn't. He still wanted the paycheck. He just didn't feel completely dependent on it. That's psychological freedom. But here's the trap. You hit $650,000 and start thinking you've already won. You loosen your discipline. You upgrade your lifestyle. You take unnecessary risks, because losing $50,000 suddenly feels less painful than it used to. Don't confuse momentum with invincibility. At this stage, protecting the machine becomes almost as important as feeding it. Then you reach the number everybody talks about, $1 million. And this is where the math gets strange, because the first million can take a long time. But once you have $1 million invested, A 7% average return represents roughly $70,000 of potential annual growth. Again, not guaranteed. One year could be positive, another could be negative, but over long periods, the scale of the capital becomes enormous. Here's the part that breaks people's intuition. Going from $0 to $1 million might take roughly 29 years if you're consistently investing $500 a month and earning around 7%. But going from $1 million to $1.5 million doesn't necessarily require another 14 or 15 years. At that same hypothetical 7% return, you're starting with a much larger engine. $1 million growing at 7% adds about $70,000 in a year. You only need another $500,000. So the timeline can compress dramatically. In one illustration, $1 million to $1.5 million can take roughly 6 years. That's the compounding curve. Your first million is built largely by discipline. After that, the money you've accumulated can become the dominant force. And that's why saying, "It took me 29 years to make $1 million, so the next million will take another 29, is the same mistake all over again. You're measuring a snowball by how hard it was to start pushing, not by how big it has become. There's an old farmer's way of thinking about uncertainty that applies beautifully here. Imagine a farmer preparing for a drought. When everyone else is enjoying perfect weather, he doesn't say, "Great, I never need to prepare." He stores what he can, because he understands that bad conditions aren't a surprise. They're part of the cycle. Markets are similar. When a crash happens, your portfolio statement can look terrifying. But if you're still earning money, still investing, and your time horizon is measured in decades, falling prices can mean the same amount of money buys more shares. The market isn't asking you to feel brave. It's asking whether your plan survives when you don't feel brave. That's the hidden advantage of consistency. A crash is painful if you're forced to sell. It's very different when you're still accumulating. Now let's make this personal. Meet Sarah and Jess. They're both 30 years old, same income, same general career opportunities, same ability to invest. Neither one has special financial information. Sarah decides to automate $500 every month into a diversified investment portfolio. Jess decides she'll start investing when she has more money. At age 40, Sarah has contributed $60,000. At roughly 7% growth, her account could be approaching $87,000. Jess has contributed essentially nothing. At 50, Sarah has put in $120,000. Her portfolio could be around $250,000. Jess is still telling herself she'll get serious soon. Now take them to 60. Sarah has contributed $180,000 over those 30 years. At 7%, that $500 monthly contribution could grow to roughly $610,000. Jess still has the same income potential, the same internet access, the same investment apps, the same basic information, but she doesn't have the portfolio. And notice something important. Sarah didn't win because she knew some secret stock. She won because she made one decision and automated it. The gap was behavioral, not informational. And that's one of the most uncomfortable truths about wealth building. A lot of people don't need more information. They need fewer opportunities to ignore the information they already have. Now you might be thinking, "Brian, I can't afford $500 a month." And if that's genuinely true, don't pretend otherwise. The Federal Reserve has reported that roughly 4 in 10 American adults have struggled to cover a $400 emergency expense with cash or its equivalent. So yes, there are people for whom $500 a month isn't available. In that situation, the answer isn't to feel guilty. It's to start smaller. $50, $25, even $10 if that's what your situation allows. But if you genuinely have nothing left after housing, food, transportation, debt payments, and basic necessities, then investing isn't your first problem. Cash flow is. Solve the deeper problem first. I've spent years studying the math and behavior behind wealth building, and one thing becomes obvious over and over again. The people who eventually benefit from compounding aren't necessarily the people who started with the most money. They're often the people who created a system they could actually stick with. Think back to 2008. Markets were falling hard. People were watching retirement accounts get crushed. Friends were telling friends to get out. The natural reaction was to stop buying. But imagine someone who kept making their regular investment contributions through that period. It felt awful. Every new contribution seemed to lose value almost immediately. But those contributions were buying assets at dramatically lower prices than they had been before the crash. Then the market recovered and eventually reached new highs. The person who stayed disciplined didn't need to predict the bottom. They didn't need courage every morning. They just needed a system that prevented fear from making the decision for them. That's the real power of automation. It lets yesterday's decision control tomorrow's emotions. So here's the entire framework. First, automate the contribution. $500 a month is the example we've used, but the amount should match your actual situation. The goal is consistency, not pretending you're richer than you are. Second, endure the psychologically brutal first $100,000. That's the stage where your effort feels enormous and the portfolio's contribution feels tiny. Keep going, because around $100,000, the potential annual growth starts becoming comparable to what you're contributing. Third, understand the inflection points. $100,000, then roughly $650,000, where 7% represents about $45,500 of potential annual growth. Then $1 million, where 7% represents roughly $70,000. The numbers aren't guarantees. They're reminders of scale. And that's the real lesson. $1 million doesn't come from finding a magical investment. It comes from surviving the years when your progress looks unimpressive long enough for the mathematics to change. Understanding this is easy. Executing it for 20, 25, or 30 years is much harder. And that's exactly why the opportunity exists. Because the math doesn't require you to be brilliant. It requires you to keep going after the excitement wears off.